Welcome back, everybody, to another episode of the Southern Outdoorsman Podcast, coming at you from Athens, Georgia today. From, I guess this is the temporary headquarters of Georgia Outdoor News. Mr. Andy Bars was generous enough to let us use this incredible space that he has here, so thank you, Andy. But today we got a really special podcast. We're going to be talking all things antlers with a couple guys who know a lot about antlers. First, we got Brian Murphy. Brian, you're the CEO of the QDMA for 23 years, correct?
That's right, yeah.
Sweet.
Had a good long run. Enjoyed every bit of it.
That's right. And now you're with GON.
I am, yeah. Joined the GON team, taking over the magazine of our state, which is more than just that. But 38-year history of providing the latest information on deer hunting and fishing and all things outdoors in Georgia. So yeah, that's my new hat.
Yeah, definitely. Appreciate you helping us set this up, by the way. I'm super excited. We got a bunch of interviews today. This is going to be really fun. Also in the building, we got Mr. Karl Miller, Professor Emeritus at Georgia, and you've been studying whitetails for 45 years, correct?
Correct.
Man.
Actually, I've been studying them all my life, but so from about 8 years old on, but formally for about 45 years.
Okay. And then, of course, how could we forget? We have the ginger bow hunter here.
It's not about me today. We got other people on the podcast. Well, I'm excited to have both of you guys on the podcast again. We're going to do a couple different episodes today, but to kind of kick us off, Brian, I know we're going to talk a lot about antlers and from a probably biological, but also like maybe just more details than probably even me and Andrew know about it because we've never had like a formal education on antlers, and same thing with a lot of the audience members. So I'm really excited to kind of get into the weeds of things because we have a bunch of props. Y'all, the video. This is definitely something you want to go check out on YouTube because we're gonna have a lot of stuff you're gonna kind of showcase today. And there's a few different what we call cool bucks. Okay, got some weird rack, busted up weird sides that we're gonna look at today and kind of figure out, I guess the reason why some of that stuff happens. So Brian, how do you want to kick everything off?
Well, I think a good starting point is to kind of frame up what whitetails are, where they came from, why deer have antlers, what are the benefits of antlers, how do they differ from horns, and then kind of get into the minutia of different types of antler deformities, the contribution of age, genetics, nutrition on antler development, how each of those play a role. I think over my career working with deer hunters, few subjects generate more discussion than deer antlers in one way or the other, whether it's big deer or quote cull bucks or spike bucks used to be a big debate for a number of years. How much impact of genetics really plays in wild deer? Can you manipulate genetics in the wild? Nutrition, age, the relationship of age. Now with vast majority of hunters across the country practicing some form of buck restriction. Just how long do you have to let those bucks get old to produce quality antlers? And then if you see something that's a little bit abnormal with an antler, what does that mean? Is that genetic in cause, or is that some other factor? So there's a whole gamut of stuff here that we can cover, and luckily we have enough time that we can dig into a lot of good stuff.
Absolutely. So if you're a listener or viewer out there really obsessed with deer antlers and maybe trying to find the biggest, best deer you can get on your property, or if you're hunting publicly and trying to find one of those bucks, this would be an interesting one to discuss. So you may give us that rundown, because we have, I don't know what type of horn this is right here in front of us, but the difference between horns and antlers, because I will say this, I don't know if it's a southern thing. I got a bunch of Midwest buddies. I don't see them using the term horns all that much, but I feel like it's a very southern thing. Like, oh man, look, he's got some great horns, or guys are shedding, oh man, I found a good horn today. And I'm like, anyways, so it's an interesting discussion. Can you explain the differences between horns and antlers?
Yeah, in fact, as a trained deer biologist, that's one of the things that makes a good deer biologist cringe is when somebody says deer horns, because they're so structurally different. And what I have today is a water buffalo horn, but it could be a goat horn, a cow horn, a bighorn ram. I mean, anything with a horn. And there are some really fundamental differences between the two. And one of the most important is just what they're made of. Horn is comprised of keratin, compressed hair, if you will, or fingernail material. Antlers are true bone, at least during the growth process. Antlers grow from the tip. Horns grow from the base. So very different in how they grow. One of the biggest differences is obviously that antlers are grown and shed each year. Horns are permanent. And that's a big difference, because, if you're a horned animal, let's call it a bighorn sheep, if you break your horn, there's no way to fix it. That's it. It's broken for life, right? Another big difference is that typically a horned animal is going to have, well, not typically, every time, the biggest horn it's going to have during its lifetime, if it's not broken, is at its death. That's not the case for a cervid, a deer family member. They're going to typically peak out in whitetails 5 to 7 years of age, plus or minus, some later. But that's kind of a window of opportunity for them. If they break an antler, injure an antler, hand me that one there. I'll give you one example. If this is an example of a buck that broke its main beam during the growth phase. Obviously, this was not genetics; it was just an injury. It had a chance to kind of repair that to some extent, but the next year it produced a normal, undamaged antler. A horned animal can't do that. All right, so some pretty big fundamental differences there. I think one of the most fascinating things, and I'm just an antler geek when it comes to information on them. I mean, I decided, much like Karl at a very young age, that's what I wanted to do for my life, is study and work with whitetails, and I've been blessed to do that. Made that decision at age 12, and even convened a meeting with my parents and said, I have decided. Not that often that 12-year-olds do that, and they asked me what that was. I said, well, I want to be a wildlife biologist and study deer. And they looked at me very perplexed and said, is that a real job, and does it pay money? And I've spent the next 45 years trying to answer both of those questions.
I think we both grew up with that same background.
Yeah, so I saw my first deer at a very young age, and it just absolutely enamored me. I was a part of rural northeast Oklahoma that didn't have many deer at the time, and when you see that deer you've read about, I'd read about them in Outdoor Life, Field and Stream, the magazines of the 70s, and had dreamed of seeing one. And when I finally came face to face with a doe out in the woods, that was it. It was my calling in life, and I've been blessed to work all over the world and a long time here in the U.S. With whitetails and with hunters. First and foremost, I'm a hunter. I'm an outdoorsman. That's where my passion came from. So some of the most fascinating stuff about antlers is that the antler that we now recognize on a whitetail, this is a modern thing. The ancestor to the whitetail, we had a common ancestor for whitetails, mule deer, and blacktail deer. So all three have a common ancestor. They came across the Bering Land Bridge a couple of million years ago, and then they split into the three channels, and different ice ages and advancement retreats of ice ages caused those populations to get sort of separated for hundreds of thousands of years so that they can become what we now know as those species. But the modern ancestor, or the distant ancestor, didn't have antlers at all. They had large canines. So we have a few deer around the world still that have large upper canines. That's their secondary sexual characteristic, which antlers are considered. And they slowly lost those canines and developed these sort of temporary structures that are much like a pronghorn antelope are today, where they had a bony substructure and a piece they cast. That was eventually lost and just became what we now know as antlers. What's interesting is a small percentage, well under 1% we think, of whitetails still carry the upper canines. So if you talk to taxidermists, it's not uncommon for them to find. In fact, we shot a doe on our property last year, 20 minutes south of where we're talking today, and sitting at the skinning shed, and I was already cleaning some does my daughter had shot, and one of our hunters pulls up with a doe, and he goes, hey, you mind just go ahead and agent it for me while you're here so I don't have to pull the jawbone or do anything? I said, sure. So I cut the mouth, and I said, you don't know what you got. And he said, what do you mean? I said, you got a unicorn. He goes, no, it's a doe. And, I said, no, you got a doe with canines. And he said, really? I didn't know they had those. And I said, well, they don't, as a rule. Probably the coolest buck I've ever seen was a 150 class Kansas buck with 3/4 inch upper canines. I mean, you talk about a bad mamma jamma. He was I think he was 4 or 5 years old, but a big deer on the hoof, 250 pounder with canines and a big rack. I'm like, he walked in and he took names when he came in there. So what we have is this new structure, relatively new structure we know as antlers and whitetails, and there's some really, really cool new science out of China that really is fascinating to me. First thing that they've discovered is that the process through which antlers grow is really a form of bone cancer, which is really cool because nothing can grow as fast as antlers and cancer, right? I mean, those two are very fast growing things, and it's amazing that a whitetail can put on this much bone in 100 days or so. And so to do that, they have to do a couple of things. One, they have to kind of sort of turn on this form of controlled bone cancer, and they're the only mammal that can turn it on and turn it off, which is pretty cool. The other thing they do, which is unique to cervids, is they go through a form of controlled osteoporosis. There's not enough minerals in their diet during the antler growth period for them to grow the size antlers they need through their what they can take in nutritionally wise. So they have to rob their skeletal systems. So they rob their skeletal systems for these nutrients to grow these antlers, and then they repair themselves. No other mammal can do that. So if we can, from a human science standpoint, it's really cool because if we could, learn how to start and stop a cancer and start and stop osteoporosis, that's some pretty cool stuff for us. The other two wow factors about antlers, before I kind of pitch it to Karl and let him start talking about some of the different causes of antler deformities, various things, is that this connection that exists between what I'll call a hardened antler, not the growing one, but this is basically dead bone at this stage. This connection that exists with the pedicle, stump on the skull, is the only known connection between a dead tissue and a live tissue. And you think, how in the world can an animal keep a dead piece of bone on their body? And it's through a very complex little structure called haversian canals, right? And think of those as these little straw structures, right? And straws that are holding the antler to the head during the normal time which deer will carry their antlers. They're filled with, I'll just call it a jello-like substance, right? And you can imagine that a straw filled with something is stronger than a straw that's not, okay? So what happens is when testosterone levels start to decline after the breeding season and after winter in most parts of the whitetails range, the material in those straws gets basically sucked out and the straws get brittle. And that's what allows that antler to break off and fall to the ground. That's called the abscissin layer. And there's something called osteoclasts that form at that point. But it's a very unique process. And the other wow factor to me is that the velvet that covers the antler during the growth period is really analogous to human skin in a lot of ways. Very cool. But the one difference is that it's the only known skin-like substance that we're aware of that can consistently heal with no scarring. So no matter how many times you cut an antler, it grows with zero scarring. Okay. Human tissue doesn't do that. We scar. So, in fact, in China right now, they're using some of the science behind velvet antler to work with burn victims to try to repair, human, injuries, and that could be a great advancement in our science, right? If we can repair our wounds, and I've got many, that without scarring would be great. So, a lot of really cool stuff out there on antlers. Before we kind of get into, age, nutrition, and genetics, I think that's probably the next step.
I think there's some things we can expand a little bit on what you're talking about. Is we really don't know at this point how antlers actually originated. What caused this structure? We know how it's done, but what actually triggered it back in prehistory. But antlers are formed by the structure, a group of cells called the periosteum that's located on the deer's forehead. And both males and females have it. So females do have the ability to grow an antler. But it's not triggered because that periosteum is triggered by testosterone in that buck's first spring. There's a little surge of testosterone that causes that periosteum to start to grow, and it makes a connection with the frontal bone and causes the formation of the little buttons on that buck's first antlers. And that periosteum is located in, like I said, on the forehead patch of the deer. But what's really intriguing is there's researchers that have found that you can take that periosteum and attach it to other parts of the deer and actually get a bone, an antler, to grow on other parts of the deer. And it will go through the same process of growth and shedding. And they actually have used it and have transported it onto nude mice as well and grown antlers off nude mice because of that structure there. And we know that that's under the influence of testosterone to get it to start. It's kind of uncertain what the actual hormone basis behind the antler growth phase is, but most biologists or most researchers think it's IGF-1, growth factor 1, and which is kind of interesting because that's why a lot of athletes, IGF-1 is also involved in wound healing and physical recovery, body recovery, and that's why a lot of athletes like to take deer antler. It hasn't been proven that is effective, but that's a basis behind them using deer antler supplements. So that IGF-1 plus other things, are cortisol and other ones, are increasing during the summertime during that antler growth phase, and that's causing that antler to grow. And you see that Brian was talking about these. Well, he was talking about the osteoclasts, but there are what are called osteoblasts. Osteoblasts are the ones that structure the antler. The antler is actually growing cartilage. And then when it goes through mineralization, that mineralization changes the cartilage back into mineral bones. And again, that's all under the influence of hormones as well, until you get into the fall, where the rise in testosterone in response to the changing in photoperiod at that time of year causes that testosterone. It causes that antler growth period to stop. It also causes the drying up of the velvet and shedding of the velvet as well. And that's what actually holds the antler on the deer all the way through the breeding season. And it's the decline in testosterone after the breeding season that starts this osteoclastic aspect, or basically osteoclast is what tear down the bone. Osteoblasts build the bone, osteoclasts tear down the bone. And what's really intriguing about that aspect of it, it's not a gradual process. It's there and it's done in almost a day or two, because almost all deer shed their antlers within a day or two of each other. Sometimes they shed them both at the same time. You find them in a food plot right side by side. And so that osteoclastic activity goes really fast.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, to get back to Karl, it was really cool, the research he was quoting, that they transferred the antler growth tissue, if you will, from the skull and pedicle region to different parts of the body. Backs and legs were some of the areas that they've tested, and to see a little antler growing off the side of a deer's leg is a pretty cool thing. It goes through the velvet stage. It goes through everything. It's not a big antler. We're not seeing something like this growing on the side of their body. But one thing that's really cool there is that this tissue doesn't only reside on the pedicle. Okay, so a lot of times you'll see a deer with an accessory antler coming off the forehead. Okay. It's because that tissue is laying there normally dormant, okay, not doing anything. Under trauma, under probably some conditions we don't know, it can basically sprout an accessory antler off that, because that tissue isn't just on the pedicle. A lot of people think that's the only place an antler can grow. It's not exactly the case.
So I mentioned that does have that same material there as well, but they don't get the testosterone trigger unless there's something physiologically unusual about them, and that's why sometimes we may get an antler doe, or sometimes an injury might cause that to start to grow, and you can get an antler doe. Now, an antler doe is not going to go through the yearly cycle like a buck is, because she doesn't go through the changes in testosterone, but she can grow an antler that would be a permanent. It wouldn't be a deciduous antler.
Right. Almost it's similar situation to a velvet buck, right? When we talk about velvet bucks, we're talking about bucks during the normal hard antler season that are still in velvet. Okay. Number of reasons can cause that, but the underlying factor in all of those is they have insufficient testosterone levels to finish the mineralization and velvet shedding and casting process. So they can grow an antler just fine. Okay, so they can grow an antler in the absence of substantial testosterone, but the problem is without that spike that we get about this exact time of the year. We're talking about, almost September 1st. In fact, I had my first bucks shedding velvet on our property yesterday and the day before. So my first couple of bucks are shedding as we speak, shedding their velvet. They've had this spike of testosterone. So without that, they can't finish. So it's funny, Karl and I was one of Karl's graduate students years ago. We had a buck at our deer pens that was very aggressive to students, right? I mean, we, tried to hurt people. His name was Bud, and Bud was a pain in the, because we have to, work with these deer, right? It's a captive deer research facility. We got students and injury concerns, and so we decided we had
the background. Some deer are more tractable than other ones.
Yeah.
This one was not.
I mean, there was no way to break his attitude to work with him, right? So we had two options, basically put him down or change his attitude significantly through a surgical procedure. And if you know what I'm talking about, removed a couple of things that he cherished. And so
God bless him.
Bud became Bud Light after the process.
Oh, in today's world, doesn't that mean a lot?
Yeah, exactly now. It has an extra connotation that it didn't have 25 years ago. So what was funny about
That's fantastic.
So what's funny about this? So we took this buck that was super aggressive down to tactile as it comes. Right? He doesn't know what he is. He's an it. Undetermined gender. Perfectly easy to work with, fluffy little tarsal glands. He's not rutting. He's just happy, right? He's just a doe with antlers. And it's now November, and he's in full heart, soft velvet antler. So Karl and I said, hey, it'd be nice to experiment a little bit and give him some testosterone to let him finish this cycle, right? And so we looked in the literature, and there wasn't good guidance, right? How much you give a buck that doesn't have natural testosterone. So, like a good food plotter, we took the recipe and doubled it, and we hit Bud Light with I think it was 180 whatever it was of testosterone at the time, and it was plenty. I'll say plenty. He went through an accelerated rut. He got so wound up. It was like he was on some sort of methamphetamine. So we had to take him out of the barn and put him in one of our larger outer pens. And he ran laps for a few days. And he'd stop just to scrape and rub, and then he did that. And then he hardened his antler. Right, we gave him enough to finish the process. So he hardened the antler. He shed the velvet, and within 2 weeks, 3 weeks, he cast his antlers. He went through the whole thing. Because the testosterone we gave him was short-lived, right? It was not, he wasn't producing it. We gave it to him. And so he cast, and what was interesting is he cast so quickly that those osteoclasts didn't have time to form properly, and we had a concave surface to his pedicles, which was really cool, very different than the sort of more convex, typical pedicle material. But yeah, Bud Light was a great learning curve for us. So we learned the maximum you can give a buck. We don't know what the minimum is, but so Bud Light was our test subject then, which was a lot of fun.
What's interesting is the first person that ever discovered that testosterone, or not testosterone, but the male gonads were important in the antler cycle was Aristotle, who found that a castrated buck would not shed his antlers, and he reports that in some of his writings back, in the Greek days. So it's been known for a long time that testosterone or something associated with the testes drives the antler cycle.
Mm-hmm. What's really cool there too is that a button buck, if he gets to that stage that Karl mentioned earlier where he hardens that button in the first year, okay, he's reached puberty essentially. So he's hardened that button off. If something happens to his testicles after that, he can still grow a set of antlers, but he'll never cast it or shed it, right? He'll be a velvet buck. However, if he never goes through puberty and something happens, he'll never grow an antler at all. So he'll be a hummel, as they call them overseas. So when that whole timing of puberty, it really matters. So for a buck to be a velvet buck, they have to have enough to go through puberty to produce that first set of antlers. Now, what's interesting also about those velvet bucks is because they don't shed, right? They're in velvet their whole life. They add a little bit to it each year. Okay, so it's an interesting thing. It's not a full science suggests maybe 15% new growth each year, so it's not 100% on 100%, or we'd have elk out there, right? But the challenge there is that particularly in northern environments, we get necrosis of the velvet, death of the tissue. It's not supposed to be on the animal during minus 40 in Minnesota. So you get some death of that tissue. It's also still very brittle, right? Because it never hardened properly. So they can break pieces off. So you get some very distorted, often almost ugly looking racks because they've grown on top of each other and they've broken pieces off and they've patched the velvet, and it's just been kind of a hodgepodge of things that are abnormal for that animal. That's where you get these sort of odd-shaped velvet bucks that we see. So
that would be like a cactus buck, people call it.
Correct.
Right?
That's one version of a cactus buck. Yeah.
Right.
That's usually a cryptorchid, as we call them, which has one testicle or just insufficient testosterone.
Following up on Brian's story about when we injected Bud Light with a testosterone, subsequently we did some studies on. We were looking at clearance rates of testosterone in deer, and we used one doe we had that we used as our control doe. So we gave her testosterone in the fall, and she went into a heat that lasted a month. And she basically became a doe nymphomaniac. I mean, she would stand for anything. You put your hand on her butt, she was ready. You know what I mean? So
that would be popular in Arkansas.
I'm glad you're not planning on hunting in Arkansas anytime soon. Oh, I lost my train of thought now.
Nympho doe.
Yeah, but.
This thing's digressing quickly.
I didn't think this conversation was going here. I'm not gonna lie. This is great.
The interesting part is, and the take home is that all of these physiological processes are under the influence of hormones. The testosterone in the doe is probably converted to estradiol or something like that would cause her to come into heat. So that yearly cycle is always a cycle basically on testosterone, which is based on photoperiod.
Okay. Now, I want to get into a little bit more of influences of like what makes a really big deer, and specifically you have this interesting antler right here, which is an example of something that got damaged in velvet. One thing I wanted to ask about that antler is all the crazy little kickers he's got off the backside. If you can kind of show it to the camera.
Yeah, so this was a deer that was one of our research deer at the University of Georgia. We actually got him through a confiscation. He was raised originally by a citizen without a permit, and DNR found out about it. So University of Georgia ended up getting this buck late in his life, and all we knew about this buck when we got him was that he had a recent history of producing some abnormal points. Not this breakage, but the other abnormals. And so that's all we knew about him. I think he was 9 or 10 when we got him, so he was already an older deer. And so what happened to this particular buck that caused the main beam damage to start with is he was in one of our large outer pens, and he got into a kickboxing match during June with a 4-year-old. And bucks, as you may know, fight like does during the soft antler time of the year. They don't fight with their antlers because they're tender and so forth. But he got his main beams kickboxed and cracked that one, broke that one completely in half. And what was interesting about this one is I was out there the day, I didn't see the fight, but I surmised what happened. I was out there the day it happened, later that day, and this piece was swinging loose in the velvet. Right, it was completely severed, but the velvet stayed intact, and it looked like a golf ball or ping pong ball full of blood in the bottom of it. So it was kind of a bulbous underneath the velvet. And I went back and told Dr. Miller here. I said, what do you think is going to happen? And we were like, I don't know. Maybe it's just going to fall off. Well, because it was cartilage mostly at the time, maybe there's some connective tissue still attached that we couldn't see because, again, it was covered with velvet. It obviously knitted back together. So that was pretty cool. Now, this is a temporary injury, for that season. Wouldn't have affected him next year. But what's interesting about all the other stuff is the influence of it's a complex interaction between age and genetics. And so a good friend of mine, Dr. Harry Jacobson from Mississippi State, retired professor emeritus there, did a lot of pioneering work on deer antlers and genetics, and talking with him and others in the deer farming world and others in the deer research world, it's a guess, but we think at least half of all bucks, if given long enough to live, will express some genetic non-typical traits. So they may be typical most of their life, but as they get older, they have a higher and higher percentage of producing non-typical characteristics. So there's an interaction between age and genetics that we don't fully understand, and we think that's what largely explains most of this, which is not uncommon in a 10, 11. I mean, we don't see many 10-year-old bucks in the wild, right? And where we see a lot of those are in places like Texas and Canada, where bucks get to live a lot older than they do in Pennsylvania or Georgia or Alabama. So where we see the highest number of non-typical characteristics, and I'm talking about little kicker points and splits and things, are typically where the age classes of the bucks are the oldest. So we see that interaction quite often. In fact, this is another just example. This was another research deer I know well. At this age, he was, I think he was 8.5 on this set of antlers, but up until age 7, he was perfectly typical 8-point. He started doing this as he got older. So we see that over and over and over, that if a buck gets old enough, they will start throwing those. In fact, it's fairly uncommon for a buck under 4.5 years of age to show any real non-typical traits. It happens, but I'm just saying it's not common. Most of the non-typical stuff you see are going to be on older bucks. I've got another good example here somewhere.
Well, it also does turn out that there's some inherited aspects of this as well, that some bucks have a genetic predisposition. Antler characteristics are somewhat inherited from either the dam or the male. So, bucks that are typically forming a lot of abnormal antlers, kicker points and drop points and stuff like that, generally their progeny will have a tendency to do the same thing.
Yeah. So it's kind of, it certainly genetics are involved, like I said, but age often helps reflect those traits. And
well, it doesn't get manifested until that age.
Correct, yeah. So this is another example of a buck that was perfectly typical his whole life until he got to 8.5. This was the year he was harvested. He threw these splits and kickers and things. Otherwise, he was, and you also see more what we call purling. So this knotty substrate at the base we call purling. Very common with increasing age. Very uncommon in young deer. So none of these are hard, fast rules, but they're pretty characteristic.
Yeah, it's interesting you bring that up, and that's exactly where I was wanting you to go. A friend of ours, Alan Summerford, he kills more gigantic, ridiculous deer in Alabama than probably anybody else that we know. And he's got a house full of just giant deer, and he's got a surprising amount of drop tine deer. And he's not like old or anything. He's a young guy, and he's killed a lot of really nice deer. And I was talking to him about it, and he said that it seemed like there was just there was something to letting them get to be 5.5 rather than 4.5. He said 4 to 5. That's where you get the really good mass. That's where you get the really gnarly bases, purling. That's where you start getting the non-typical points, and that's pretty much exactly what he said.
100%. No, we've seen it over and over for a long time. So yeah, there's no one thing I can tell you with everything related to deer, whether we're talking home range or antlers or anything in between. There's no hard fast rule. Yeah, there's always exceptions, but there are certainly preponderances of trends that we see with increasing age. Drop tines, very much a genetic thing, right? If you see a naturally these are, again, good example. People want to say, is that genetics or not? If you see any kind of knotting or healing, acorn points, we call them the little bulbous points, that's where they've injured it. You can see where the body has repaired itself. Very easy to see that these are not genetics. A naturally occurring drop tine, there's no injury I know that can make a drop tine, right? A true just drop tine. So certainly there's some genetic related traits and there's some injury related traits, and that'll be a good discussion we can dive into a little bit. I think before we dive into, because that's a huge can of quote unquote cull bucks, management bucks, antler deformities, which are genetic, which are not. What does the research say? Even if you can find that genetically inferior deer and take it, does that matter in a wild situation? So we can get into that. But I think the next logical step would be to talk about the broad influences of age, nutrition, and genetics, the big three as we call them. They've always been the big three. They'll always be the same big three. And Karl, you might want to dive in there of how you would rank them, in terms of importance. In a free-ranging, we always have to define our terms, in a free-ranging situation.
All right. Well, I mean, it's pretty clear in the way we've been talking, it's pretty clear that number one is always going to be age. A yearling buck is just not going to grow a great set of antlers. They're not going to reach their maximum or their peak antler configuration till 4.5, 5.5, 6.5 years old. And it may vary a little bit depending on the part of the country you're in, on the quality of the habitat. You go to South Texas, it might be a little bit delayed, and it might be under the influence of environmental conditions down there. On really great habitat, you can grow some phenomenal deer at 4.5, 5.5 years old. But once you reach that peak at 4.5, 5.5, subsequent years, they don't tend to add much at all. Now, again, there's variation. Some may get bigger at 7, 8 years old. We've had deer in the deer pens that just kind of exploded around 7 years old. But, in the norm, it's going to be somewhere in the 5.5, 6.5 year old is where they're going to reach their peak. And the only thing you can do to manage for that is keep your finger off the trigger, That's very simple to manage for age structure.
And nutrition I would rank second in the free-ranging situation. A lot of people want to talk genetics first, and certainly genetics, if you're in a high fence, if you're on an island, if you're in a deer pen, those are different situations. You can control more aspects, and while we can't. Nutrition is often limiting. A lot of people have, quote, food plots, but if you really look at it, on a landscape level, it's quarter acre scratched out, poorly done, a patch of something to kill them over. It's not really nutritional, investment much in the deer herd, or a lot of people focus on native vegetation, of course. So nutrition is key, and most hunters, when they think, if I pitch how do you help deer nutrition, almost all of them would say, what can I feed them? Deer feed or a food plot or native vegetation. I mean, there'll be a lot of good answers. One I'll almost never hear, and it's often the most important, depending on where you are, is density management, controlling the number of deer, because that does more for your deer nutrition than almost anything else you can do. Because if you don't have enough groceries for the deer herd you have, the best thing you can do is take mouths off that range, and you typically can't prop it up with enough sacks of deer feed if it's just too high. Each deer, on average, consumes about 1 ton of dry matter weight per year per animal. Okay, so the average food plot might produce a ton per acre, of forage if you do it well. But you're talking about, it takes a lot of food plots to feed 20 deer, let alone 60, 80, 100 deer. So nutrition is really key. And genetics is really where a lot of hunters want to focus, because that opens up the opportunity for, quote, cull bucks and the whole discussion, the feel-good stuff. I shot a buck and needed to get out of the gene pool, okay? How many times have we heard that, right?
Oh, yeah.
All you got to do is listen to a TV show and watch them. Had to get that ratty deer out of my deer herd to help my genetics, okay?
Before we get you too fired up on the genetics aspect of it, let's get back to the nutrition, because that is beyond age, that is critical. Mm-hmm. And it was actually King Edward in the 14th century, his huntsman was the first one to really document this. He said the head grows according to the pasture and otherwise, which means, as good as the better you can have the habitat out there, the better the head's going to be on that. And he was basically the first quality deer manager, the first trophy manager back there in the 14th century. So we've known this for a long time. And, so having your habitat in good shape, having your density relative to the habitat and that habitat's capability, which is going to vary in different parts of the country as well. The soil is going to drive a lot of that. In areas where you've got good quality soils and good growing conditions, you're going to grow better quality animals than if you don't have good soils. In sandy ridge areas or in south along the coastal plain in Georgia, Alabama, South Carolina, you just don't grow a lot of trophy animals because the soil conditions aren't good enough for them. But consider that compared to the upper Midwest. Part of that is genetics. They have different subspecies. But look at Georgia. Georgia's been stocked with subspecies from all over the country. And we grow some good deer, but we grow those good deer in areas where we've got good habitat. We've got good agricultural land. We've got good agricultural land because the soil is good there. So the deer have plenty to eat. They're allowed nutritionally to reach their genetic potential.
Mm-hmm. You brought up an interesting little rabbit hole that I like to go down. A lot of hunters, Georgia's a great example. We kill some of our biggest deer in metro Atlanta, right? Mm-hmm. 180-inch deer coming out of DeKalb County, Fulton County, and a lot of people go, wow, why? Well, and the same's true around St. Louis, Missouri, and a lot of these major metropolitan areas have big deer, and a lot of people think, well, it's just because they're eating, lush gardens out of people's backyards, and that's part of it. Part of it's because they can get old sometimes. But a big part of it is because the soils are better there. If you look at where humans build our big cities, they're typically in riverine systems with good agriculture soils around them because they need water and they need to grow crops. So a lot of our cities are situated in very good deer habitat because they're good human habitat, okay? So don't ever overlook the fact of good soils and good productivity being in where big cities are. So it's not the city factor by itself, it's also the dirt that the city sits on that's real important there.
Brian, real quick. I want to ask you guys, this is a very interesting discussion. If someone was going to look to lease or buy property, okay, or maybe go hunt public land or something like that, what are some of those factors you would want to look at from a habitat standpoint that would potentially give you the opportunity, like not taking age structure out of the equation because you don't know what you're getting into, but what kind of habitat would you want to look at if someone was going to lease property or try to buy property in the Southeast that potentially could grow the deer based off the habitat aspect?
Well, I'll let Karl jump in. I've got my thoughts, but go ahead.
Okay, well, there's a couple of things that I would think about. First, there's a couple good maps out there that show the distribution of Pope and Young and Boone and Crockett, producing counties in the country, and those are reflective of the soil. So you can look at you can use them as a surrogate for soil quality or habitat quality, because if they're growing Pope and Young and Boone and Crockett, they either have age structure A or they have the nutritional capability of growing those things. So that would be the first place I would start, and looking at the dirt itself based on either that type of map or soils maps or something like that. If they're agricultural areas, obviously the farmers are growing crops there, the soil is good enough to grow crops there. So that'd be a key one as well.
Yeah, so Georgia Outdoor News, in fact, produces the Fab 40, the top 40 bucks killed, and we have county by county rankings for every county in the state. We keep up with them over time. There's thousands of records. The quickest way in Georgia, and it's true in many states, is to look up a state map of where all the big deer come from, because past history is a good indicator of future success, right? It's not a given. So the first thing I do is identify counties or areas of the state that have a history of producing good deer. We want to start there. Habitat-wise, I can do a lot with habitat. I can take a dog-eared property and make good habitat out of it if it's big enough to affect that deer herd, okay? If I'm talking about 50 acres, I can make my 50 acres great, but if everything's crap around me, I can't do much with it. So I tell people, look at it like 2,000-acre scale, even if you're only leasing 200 acres. But think of that landscape around you and look at it as a whole, because that affects your deer herd no matter what you do. that neighboring track and the habitat quality of it will greatly influence the deer quality on your property, no matter what you do. You can make your 50 acres heaven, and that's great, and you should do that, but you can't overwhelm what 2,000 acres of habitat around you can do, good or bad, for you. So I'd always be looking at larger neighbors is better. Fewer hunters nipping at the corners, and so big cooperative neighbors, what they do from a management perspective is probably as big as what their habitat is. If they're on board with you, whatever your goals are, if it's 3-year-old deer, 4-year-old deer, whatever it is, if you can talk to them before I lease or buy a piece of ground and get to know what their philosophy is, that's huge.
Perfect.
Huge. So it's the habitat itself I can do a lot with. I can take a really ugly, torn up piece of habitat and make it better. And if it's a big tract, 1,000 acres or more, yeah, I can almost survive to some extent without good neighbors. But the luxury is, for most hunters, the average hunter in America hunts on 200 acres or less. That's a given. It's a fact. Regardless of all the big properties you hear about and big leases in the South, numerically, the average hunter hunts on a couple hundred acres or less. So they should make their property the best bed and breakfast in town, to have a disproportionate number of deer using their property and setting up to harvest those animals. But again, step back, go on Hunt Stand, go on Google Earth, wherever you have to, and look at a 2,000 acre, 3,000, 5,000 acre patch around you and then determine what is limiting. A good friend of ours, Dr. Grant Woods, coined a term that I love because it's simple. It's called filling the lowest hole in the bucket. If you shoot a bucket with a shotgun, where's the water going to come out first? The lowest hole. Same thing with a deer herd. If you're trying to manage a deer herd, what is that biggest piece that you're missing? A lot of people want to jump to tactics, where to set up their stands or what to plant. Those may be very good things, but if you're losing it to some other factor, you got to plug that hole first. And so always step back, think before you react. Determine if I always joke when I get the calls from the guys in the Midwest that got a 80-acre tract in Iowa, and they're like, man, I need to know what to plant this summer. The blah 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 blah. I need to plant some soybeans. There's soybeans all around me, and I'm like, you just answered your own question. There's soybeans all around you. Don't you create the cover? What happens during the hunting season when they harvest that beans and corn? I want the thickest refuge that I can. So I wouldn't give up much of my ground in Iowa if I had a forested block. I wouldn't give up much of it to food plots other than some strategic cool season food plots for harvest. But I would want native warm season grasses. I would want thick cover. I want those deer to come to my property during the hunting season. I'm glad the neighbors can feed them beans and corn all summer.
That's a good point. And that idea of isolation is really important when it comes to trying to hold a big buck on your area. Some during the hunting season, during the rut, there are some bucks that you're not going to hold. They just are not going to be homebodies. They're wanderers. They may have a home range that's very different than their summer home range, and you won't keep those deer on your property. There's nothing you can do about that. And some of them become much greater wanderers but some of them actually stay at home, and they decided that this is going to be my territory. I'm going to have the does. All the does here are mine. But they also like the fact that they're isolated, that they're not getting bumped, they're not getting disturbed, so that they feel secure in those areas. So security cover can be very important in situations where you have neighbors that have maybe 2,000 acres where you're actually managing all that together the same way. If you can create the isolated habitats, the seclusion for those bucks where they feel secure, that's where they're going to hang out. But that also means you need to stay out of it too.
Mm-hmm. Now, I want to talk about pine thickets a little bit, kind of pine country. I think that the hunting club that I'm in Central Alabama is pretty representative of a lot of people that listen to this podcast, whether they're hunting public or private. And it's essentially, it's Westervelt, so it's a pine farm. We got a decent bit of thick cover on the property, and we run a lot of cameras on it. It's like 1,800 acres. We've got 18 members. Most of the guys are older. They hunt food plots. They're not killing a lot of deer off of the place. And like I said, we're trying to do buck inventory. We've been doing buck inventory for the last 2 years. Me, my stepdad, and another buddy of mine who are in the club, running a bunch of different cameras on our property. And then the friend of mine, he's also has access to all the neighboring properties as well. So we have a pretty good idea of all the different bucks that are on the place. And it's pretty much a bunch of really good 2.5-year-olds. I mean, solid 2.5-year-olds. There's a couple 3.5, what we think. I'm not like the best at ancient deer, so we don't really know. And then we have one deer that we think is like truly mature. He's a 10 point. And this year we think he's 5.5. And he didn't blow up from 4.5 to 5.5. He got thicker and he definitely added just mass, and his frame's a little bit bigger, but he didn't blow up by any means. But out of all this land that we've been looking at so far, we've got one deer that's like that 5.5-year-old, and we're sitting here talking about how you start getting these non-typical characteristics. You start getting the bucks where you're like, whoa, when they get above that 5.5, 6.5-year-old range. So on a property like this, and Brian, I really wanted to ask you this because you were the president of the QDMA for 23 years, or CEO for 23 years. And like, I remember growing up in clubs like what I'm in now and seeing the QDMA things in the pinout board and, where your organization was trying to educate people. So I'm sure you've got a good story about, maybe a success story about this in a similar habitat. So let's say I become the president of my club next year. What are some things I could do to, just increase the quality of that club? I mean, obviously shoot less of those younger deer, but it's like you've got one deer that meets the criteria, so you got 18 guys hunting one deer. Like, how do you approach that as a manager, trying to keep everybody happy? Because it's like I don't think it's quite realistic to be like, okay, no one shoot a buck for like 3 years. So what would be your advice on that?
Well, let me start with your first lead in. There is a lot of pine forest in the southeast. Obviously, the timber industry is a big part of our economy here. And a lot of hunters despise pine country. They think it's unproductive. They want hardwoods, right? Pretty white oak ridges. And I love a good white oak ridge and hardwood ridge as much as anybody. But I will tell you that in the life cycle, the typical 25 to 30-year life cycle of a pine plantation, there are several stages during that are very good, much better than hardwood forest, and some that are very bad. Mm-hmm. Okay, so somebody comes in and clear cuts a portion of a forest. Obviously, if that's where of a pine forest, if that's where your stand is, you're pissed off, and it's bad for the hunt club dynamic if they come in and clear cut a good bit of your property. But the good news is that if you can get past that ugly stage for the first couple of years, from year depends on how they site prep it, but year 3 to 8, 9, 10, you've got fantastic habitat, as good as, way better than a hardwood forest in terms of pounds per acre of fawn cover, turkey nesting, and the whole 9 yards. Then you get to that stage of, canopy, the initial canopy closure, you start getting pine straw, less understory vegetation. So until they thin, it drops again. And then they thin, it picks up again. So you have this period of kind of this roller coaster of a pine stand life cycle. But I like some pine management on a property because there are some stages during that process that do things that are very difficult to do in a typical setting. In a hardwood forest, I consider, as pretty as they are, they're intermittent fall food plots. That's all they are. All you got to do is go to Kansas and look at, it doesn't take oak trees to grow big whitetails. I'd rather have a lot more sunlight on the ground than I would big pretty oak trees. So
I would agree 100%. I would much rather manage a pine stand for deer than a hardwood stand because there's so many more things, so many more entries you can make in it. Now you were talking about Westerville. They're in the business of growing timber, so they're going to maximize fiber production. They're not maximizing deer forage, which in some ways it does go very well together. But if you're in a pine stand and your primary goal is deer, there are a lot of things you can do beyond that can open the canopy. Your production in deer forage in a pine stand is directly and inversely proportional to the canopy closure. The more you open the canopy, the more you're going to have understory. So you have some of these open canopy pine stands that are real pretty savanna type areas. They are deer factories. They can produce hundreds of pounds per acre of deer forage, whereas a hardwood forest would be in the tens of pounds per acre of forage.
I can hear the comments being typed out right now on YouTube and emails coming in like, what are they talking about? Oaks are everything. Like, acorns. And it's like you have, I don't know what it is. Maybe because they just see the abundance of oaks on good years or acorn producing trees that they see it as such a draw like for hunting opportunity, but they don't understand like outside of that little window of time, there's nothing else happening at closed canopy forest.
Yeah, think about it. Acorn, when they start to fall, they're there for about 2 months maybe. Deer have to eat 365 days a year. So that 2 months that's kind of gravy to them. If you couple that with the idea the nutritional value of an acorn is not that good as far as growing deer.
Basically corn. People bag corn for being such a poor quality. I never hear people talk about how bad acorns are for deer. I hear people talk about how bad corn is for deer. It's low in protein. It's low this. Both of them are almost identical in nutritional quality, folks.
Yeah, acorns
It's just corn coming out of the tree versus out of a spin feeder. That's the same thing, guys.
This is going to become more controversial. I thought it was going to be. Right?
The facts hurt.
Think about this: a nutritional value. The acorn runs generally about 5 to 6% protein, and deer for their maximum growth need 18% protein. So you're running 5. If you get down below 5% protein, even the deer's rumen can't function. So they can be a great energy source because the red oaks are very high in fats, the white oaks are very high in carbohydrates. So it's great for them going into the winter. They're laying on their fat. It makes them fat. They love them. It's like kids eating candy. They're very attractive. It's nice to have those acorns there when you're hunting. But when you're growing deer aren't growing during the fall when their acorns are dropping. Deer are growing antlers during the summertime. And having that summer forage out there during the antler development phase is much more important.
100%.
So going back to
your story. So the reality for any hunting club in the South is to have realistic expectations. Okay, what are realistic expectations? And I've had the privilege of managing large data sets for Plum Creek, now Weyerhaeuser, on a lot of scale. Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Georgia, where I've looked at the data sets. So what is realistic? The average hunting club in the Southeast on timber management land shoots 1 3.5 or older buck every 300 acres of habitat per year, on average. So divide your property by 300 acres, and you should have a quote, quality buck, 3-4-year-old, for every 300 acres of habitat. That's what's harvested. Okay, that's what's harvested. Now, most do get harvested under every hunting pressure. And the typical dynamic of a hunting club is, regardless of what you you tell people, it's hard for someone to pass a really pretty 3-year-old deer. You might get them past the 2-year-olds, but the 3-year-olds, even if your goal is 4 and 5-year-olds, it's really hard to get them past. And what often happens, and I've seen this over and over too, and when I first saw it as a young biologist, it perplexed me because I saw it over and over, where and I would chart the antler size by age class, and it's pretty logical. 1-year-olds, 2-year-olds, 3-year-olds, 4-year-olds. And then sometimes I'd get this decline at 5 and 6. And these are mature age bucks. These should be the best of the best. And it just perplexed me for the longest time. Like, why are these 4 and 5, 6-year-old bucks not bigger than why are the 5 and 6-year-old bucks not bigger than the 4-year-old bucks? And it finally hit me. It's because of the selective harvest pressure. The hunters are shooting those really pretty 3-year-olds because they're vulnerable and they're available, and the only ones that get older are ones that were smaller in life and got passed because they weren't big enough. Yeah. So we see this over and over and over.
They were basically high grading.
They were high grading, not necessarily genetics, and that's a whole different complex, but they were high grading the standing crop of and taking those morphological, which we call not genetics, but how they look. So those better, and I've got some examples here somewhere. So just those really pretty 2 and 3-year-olds that are just so big that people can't pass them.
Go ahead. I don't want to interrupt your question.
Well, no, it's Grant Woods. I saw him just put a reel out. You were talking about Grant Woods earlier about he was looking at some aspect of a lot of the biggest deer that get killed in the country are deer that aren't even 4 or 5 years old. He was talking about like a bunch of deer and had examples of like he had one. It was a 160-inch deer and it was 3.5. And he's like, there's so many of those like, exceptional bucks that get killed so early because their antlers. First off, it's 100%. A smaller body, so the antlers look even bigger. I mean, if you have 100, like I'm sure like in Missouri or something like that, 3-year-old's probably 160, 170 pounds maybe. They're, in a healthy environment. But he's got 160 inches on his head. It makes the antlers look even bigger if you know he's already a big deer. People are going to shoot that deer, not realizing that if they are managing for age structure, well, I'm not passing that to everybody else right now. Okay? But for the ones that are trying to shoot mature bucks, like how often those deer get killed before they ever get to show their true potential.
A good many. There's, there are, everything, and this is a very, very important concept. For every piece of dirt in the whitetails range, the antlers for a given age class and a given population follow a bell-shaped distribution within reason, okay? So if you took all 2-year-olds, some are going to be really poor. Some are going to be LeBron James. Most are going to be in the middle, okay? The challenge, and particularly in a hunting club situation, any hunting situation, is to not harvest those LeBron James, those flyers on the tail end of that distribution, because those are the super exceptional ones. And those are often the ones that, hunter will shoot, and they'll bring me the jawbone, and I'll tell them, I said, that's a 2-year-old, that's a 3-year-old. No way in the world. I'm like, I'm sorry, guy, that's what it is. We can argue until the cows come home, but that's what the That's what the jawbone reads, and not
that is why it is critically important to age your deer based on body characteristics, not by antler. Don't have your antler restrictions thinking you're protecting that age class, because you're protecting some of that age class, but some of the better ones are going to exceed those antler requirements. Learn how to age deer on the hoof, and if you're deciding to go 3.5, 4.5, whatever your goal is, when the body says to shoot it, that's when you decide to take it. Particularly if it says it's a 4.5 or 5.5 and it's underperforming as far as its antlers. That's the one you want to take out. It might not reach your antler goal criteria, but it's also never going to reach that antler goal criteria.
And they consume a disproportionate amount of feed. They bully other bucks. There's some suggestion they may even exclude bucks from setting up home ranges because they're so dominant and so old. So there's a lot of reasons to harvest these.
There's some bucks out there that in a lot of habitats that won't go 120 at maturity. And if you set a goal of 120, you are protecting that buck throughout its entire life.
I got one I need to show you. He probably doesn't break 100 inches, maybe, but I took him to my taxidermist, and I was like, man, his jaw looks, his teeth look so worn down. And he showed me he had a couple confirmed age 6 and 7 year old deer, 7.5 year old deer, and he held up against it from the same kind of area. He's like, dude, that deer is old. I don't know. I should have brought the jawbone and let y'all look at it. It's insane. But I mean, this is 6 point. It's 16 inches
he's like
wide.
that big.
Yeah.
Well, one thing that
He's
really,
probably been passed all his life.
Yeah, for sure.
one thing that really I think helps frame this is a lot of hunters watch hunting TV. They've seen a lot of South Texas stuff, and every deer looks like a Muy Grande, right? Small bodies, big antlers.
Yeah.
And there are some giant deer in Texas. I love Texas. Did cut my teeth in a lot of research in Texas as a young biologist. But the research has been done over and over and over, and it surprises people. And I'll ask you the question. If you said, all right, in the very best habitat, they call it the Golden Triangle of South Texas, the section of the best habitat, the average mature buck antler size, gross Boone and Crockett, what would you think? I'm talking about 5, 6, 7-year-olds in the best habitat in Texas.
135 inches.
Yeah, I'm gonna say probably about 130.
129 to 132 is the range.
Really?
Study after study after study. So the average buck, even in South Texas, isn't that great. In fact, some research was done years ago. I think it was done by UGA, where they looked at the age-for-age antler size from bucks from our better ag areas of Georgia, Mississippi, and South Texas. And guess who had the smallest antlers per age class? South Texas.
Okay.
So Mississippi and Georgia, in their better habitats, produce better deer age class for age class than South Texas. South Texas wins because they have 10, 20, 50,000 acre ranches, intensive feeding, low harvest pressure. They win by other ways, not because their deer are necessarily better than ours. So
and a lot of their deer get the chance to get into the 4 or 5.
That's what I'm saying.
6 years
There's
old
select.
age
Yeah,
class,
they,
right?
a lot of the deer, or not a lot, but some of the deer I have are 7, 8, 9, 10, 11-year-old bucks from South Texas. Who gets we used to have a trip to the King Ranch, the famed King Ranch. Cutie May had a relationship with a senior biologist, Mickey Hellickson, there for over a decade. So for 11 straight years, we went down there for a week each year. It was one of the best weeks of my life. We did helicopter deer capture work, and then we drove around the King Ranch shooting cull bucks on 800,000 acres.
And coyotes and hogs.
Coyotes and hogs and Nilgai antelope.
Yeah.
So it was like having keys to the kingdom, right? A week hunting trip on the King Ranch, shooting everything but good deer. So our goal was fully mature bucks under 110-inch Boone and Crockett. You'd think, how many of those would you find on the King Ranch, right? Fully mature bucks, 110 inches or less. We filled truckloads of them. We shot them by the cordwood numbers. I mean, there was a bunch of them. So the average buck in America, in most habitats, is programmed to be an 8-point deer, about 125, 130 inches. That's what the average whitetail is geared up to do. The average human is 5'8", 5'9", 175 pounds before we get fat and old.
I break that.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. I'm just saying.
I'm a cull.
So that goes back to that distribution again. So knowing what is normal for an area, and what you try to do is if I always tell people you want to be in the top 10% of your neighborhood, age for age. So you find out who the best deer management place is near you, what they're growing age for age, and you want your deer to be like theirs. You can't compare to Iowa if you're in Alabama, so that's unfair. Mm-hmm. So you want to be the best in your neighborhood. What you can do is shift that normal distribution through habitat management, proper density management. So you want more of those deer to be a little bit bigger and a few more LeBron Jameses on the tail end of the curve. You can't shift it from Alabama to Iowa, but you can shift it considerably through intensive management. So so having realistic expectations back to your hunting club. You've got to let them shoot something, right? They're paying dues, they're doing their work, they're sitting in the stands, they're anxious, and there's varying levels of expertise and experience. So it's unfair for, if you put me on a stand on your property, so we're only shooting 4.5 and older, 120 or better. I know what that is. I get it. I would be right there with you. The average hunter has a hard time doing that, separating a 3-year-old from a 4-year-old, or 110 versus 120-inch Boone and Crockett. So matching the right hunters with the property is also key. And if you have a mixture of more mature hunters like some of us that are happy going 1, 2, 3 seasons without killing a buck. I don't have to kill a buck every year. I don't many years. It's not a big deal. I pass 50, 100 bucks, and if I don't see what I'm looking for, I'm cool with that. But I've killed so many that it just doesn't matter that much anymore. Early in my career, I wanted to shoot a buck every year. So younger, inexperienced hunters are going to be more trigger happy. They're going to be more mistake prone. So you have to limit that damage. And the other big leakage I see with hunting clubs in the South, well, anywhere, is their family and guest policies. That's a big can of worms. And so, you may have a very good member, but he brings his brother-in-law who's never hunted before, and he's the one that makes the mistake and shoots the buck that everybody else has passed, and it causes a lot of friction in the hunting club. Or if you don't limit the club members, and I always prefer a club membership buck limit. So you get 1 buck and 2 does for your membership. If you want to give them to son, daughter, whatever, that's fine. But everybody and your brother can't take 1 too, because any property can only sustain the removal of so many 1 and 2 and 3-year-old bucks if your goal is to grow 4-year-old bucks. Because you lose some each age class through natural mortality. It's hard to get 5-year-old deer, even not shooting 2 and 3-year-old deer. They get harder to kill when they get older. But B, there's natural mortality causes that you lose a few. Your return on investment is not great if your goal is 6 and 7-year-old deer, unless you're in a very controlled environment like South Texas. You're not going to get many of them to that age. Just not going to do it.
But by the way, because we're coming up on time,
Yeah.
I want to get to the culling conversation. Getting back to the antlers aspect.
Well, real quick, I got one more question on the antler restriction and stuff like that. Which, by the way, there's this 1 2-year-old in our place who, out of let's say we've got 20-ish different bucks located, he's probably top 5, and he's definitely 2.5. And I'm just like, ooh. Now, when it comes to antler restrictions specifically, this is something I've always wondered about. A lot of places, growing up, it was 4-point or better outside the ears on our club. And then a different club, it was 3 or better. On most of our public land in Alabama, it's 3 or better on one side.
Yep.
On our SOAs, it's 18-inch main beam or a 16-inch inside spread. Is one type of antler restriction more effective than another one for protecting those LeBron James bucks that you're wanting to get forward? As opposed to 3 on one side, he's got to have an 18-inch main beam instead.
By the way, probably offending people. We should say Michael Jordan.
Michael Jordan.
I mean, LeBron, Michael. Yeah, it's a conversation.
Yeah, so
Tom Brady bucks.
Yeah, so there's no antler restriction that's perfect, right? They're all flawed in some way. That's why harvesting by age is far better. Straight up point restriction is probably the least useful in those, because you can have some young bucks that meet the point restriction.
Jacob's killed a bunch of them.
A bigger spread, a bigger spread, or particularly main beam length. Main beam length is going to be much more correlated with age than points. So main beam length and spread are better than points. Not great, because there's still some exceptions to those rules, but antler point restrictions are really just a baseline. What I like to tell clubs is, try to harvest by age. If you want to set a minimum of points and spread and all that, that's fine. But I would also have a buck that's fully mature with less than, in other words, have some categories so you can pick up some of these other bucks that need to be harvested.
It all depends on your hunters. Hunters can count to 3, typically. So that makes it easy if it's 3 points on the side. If they're very, very inexperienced hunters and you want to protect some of your bucks, give them something simple to look at to get them started. And then looking at estimating age, spread, or estimating main beam length. They can learn that through time. But try to wean them off of those antler point restrictions or those antler restrictions and wean them onto the age restriction based on body characteristics, because that's the key to getting them in the older age classes.
I think one of the best things that I could recommend for hunting clubs is, because mistakes will be made every year, right? Some deer are going to not be taken. There's a good chance you've got trail camera pictures of that deer. go back after the season, have a postseason wrap up, and try not to wrap Johnny's knuckles too hard unless he's done it every single year. There's always those repeat offenders you got to watch out for. But just say, hey, let's go back and look at the trail cameras. Why did you think he met the age requirement? Can't you see? In other words, use that as an example to teach and to show and share those things with people. Hey, these are good examples of 2-year-olds. These are good examples of 3-year-olds. Look at the body. Don't look at the antlers. Share that intel. Test each other. If you harvest a deer that you thought was 120 inches and he's 105, go back and say, how did I miss that? In other words, use your own deer and your own imagery, which you have tons of, to teach yourselves better to be able to age and judge those deer on your farm or your property. So that we do that all the time. We test ourselves with trail camera stuff after the season and say, what did we miss?
And be very careful with any type of penalties that you impose on them, because if you get too restrictive and the penalties you get too severe, it's going to take the fun out of hunting. People are going to be worried to death if they pull the trigger. Is that deer big enough, or am I going to get fined? 2 or 3.
Or deer left in the woods, even worse. So.
Or check it on the ground.
So it's a good point. So let's get into genetics real quick here, and I think this is a good starting point. The set of antlers I've got here off this deer. This was a University of Georgia deer that I know well, so I know everything that happened to him. It was a 3-year-old animal, and I promise you, most hunters in America, if they saw this on a 3-year-old body, they would shoot it and pat themselves on the back. Man, I'm glad I got that crappy thing out of our deer herd. Man, I don't want that thing breeding back on our does. Well, I can tell you that he only damaged his velvet during the early growth period of that year, and I'll find his antlers here shortly. And if you had harvested that deer at 3.5, you would have missed out on him at 4.5.
Oh my gosh!
And he was
back up. Yeah, there
so
you go.
He was a perfectly symmetrical 4.5-year-old animal. Scored 142 Boone and Crockett gross inches, just because he damaged his velvet the previous year. And so what I tell people is, when it comes to to velvet injuries, which is the most common type of injury, is something that happens during the antler growing time of the year. What happens in velvet stays in velvet, okay? Just like Vegas. So if it occurs during the velvet stage, it's that year's effect only. So what the rule we use on our hunting farm, and I recommend it as a minimum, is we call it the 2-strike rule. Not a 3-strike rule, 2-strike rule. If we see a deer repeat the same thing 2 consecutive years, then it becomes eligible for a management removal if we see it and want to take it. A one-off year observation on a deer is not normally enough to know what caused it and to know whether it's going to be permanent or not. There are a couple of exceptions to that rule. This is a buck that I shot 30 years ago, and you can see that it's got what you'd say is a normal antler on its right side and an abnormal antler on the left. And when I saw this buck, I immediately knew why this opposite antler was deformed. It was missing 11 inches of its opposite back leg. Okay, so we call it a contralateral deformity. It's very common. Almost 100% of the time that a deer's severely injured on a rear leg, it'll affect the opposite antler, contralateral deformity, and it's permanent. So if you see a deer that's missing a leg or got a deformed leg or carrying it and it's got a deformed antler on the opposite side, you can remove that animal if you want. It's not genetics. You can't pass this on. All right? He was hit by a car, whatever it was, shot by a gun. So I removed him because he was not going to meet our management objective, and he was going to eat food and just be a wasted animal for our management goals. I had no genetic improvement goal out of him. The opposite occurs, interestingly enough, and here's another opposite leg injury. And they often have this squiggly sort of misshapen antler on the offside, and some researchers suppose that it's for balance. I don't know that we really know why that is and exactly why the opposite effect on a rear leg. We're cross-wired, our central nervous systems, left brain, right body. We think that's largely how this phenomenon occurs. However, what's interesting is that with I don't know if I got it here. That's a pedicle. Anyway, with a front leg injury, we typically see the same antler deformed. Sometimes both. So it's not near, the pattern isn't as consistent with a front leg injury, a front leg. So that's, one of the most common causes would be, something happening during the antler growth time of the year, like the buck said here, very early in the velvet stage. And what happens is the earlier in the velvet growth the injury to that pedicle occurs, or that antler, the more profound the outcome. And just think about it, right? So if a deer's only got this much velvet growth and something bad happens to those soft velvety stumps, a lot of weird things can happen. If he's 80% done in late June and he damages a little bit, it's only so much that can go wrong at that point. So the earlier in the growth phase, the more profound the potential outcome, good or bad.
Right.
Okay.
So what you're kind of seeing, and Brian's getting into, and he's going to go beyond this, is that most abnormal antlers that you see out there are related to some type of injury to that animal, whether it's an injury to in velvet, which will not be there in the subsequent years, or an injury to the body that will be there in subsequent years. But culling a deer because of it, you got to understand the reason why that deer has an abnormal antler. Because if it's a somatic injury to the body, that deer can be taken out of there. If it's an injury to the growing antlers, give that deer the benefit of the doubt.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, always kind of have a checklist with the least likely being a genetic cause. In most parts of the whitetails range, genetics is the least common cause of. It's generally an injury to the body, as we've discussed, leg injuries. A very common one also is a pedicle injury, the pedicle itself. That can happen during shedding of the antler or during fighting. And every hunter's seen it if you picked up many shed antlers. Every now and then you'll find one with a little fragment of the pedicle, right? A piece of the, in fact, we had an antler tree at the QDMA office, and we actually analyzed it, and 15% of the antlers had a piece of the pedicle stuck on them. And that broken pedicle can cause an abnormal antler on that opposite side. So a lot of pedicle breakage may explain where we get pockets of this in Alabama, Mississippi. We see pockets of this disproportionately across the whitetails range.
And so I was bringing that up to you earlier. One of my uncle's leases 15 years ago, it was a very common trait of pretty much all the deer, no matter the age, 2.5 or older, where one side was like a big spike or like a split beam, whatever, and then the other side was a good side. And it was one of those things, they kept talking about like the genetic, kept saying genetic aspect, just like that deer. Absolutely.
Yep.
And I think like you said, there's areas where you see people talk about that on social media that their farm sets up where they just have a lot of that kind of characteristic. And is that, again, you were saying more so in some areas potentially genetic?
We see pockets of it. We don't fully understand why. In Alabama, Mississippi, the deep south, that part of the deep south, we see a lot more one antler deer. Probably some, I hate to throw that genetic word in because everybody wants to anchor it. It could be something as simple as there's some nutritional deficiency in the way the pedicle forms. It could be some other environmental condition other than genetics.
But it does seem to be very localized in some areas, particularly Alabama.
Yeah.
And given the numbers of them, the proportion of them in the population, it seems that there has to be something hereditary there.
I would lean that way too.
But there are a number of other things that can cause that same type of deformity.
Yeah. So one that was pretty.
Before you go on, you mentioned
new to science, if you will, is one that, and I'll tell you the story about this buck before Karl tells you more about the disease itself. So this buck, back in my QDMA days, we had a TV show for a few years on the Outdoor Channel, and I was up in Kentucky filming a hunt. And I'm walking out of the woods and get a call on my cell phone that another hunter on the property had encountered a buck walking in circles, oblivious to its surroundings, just walking in circles. And it only had one antler. And he said, "What do I do?" And I said, "Hold tight, tell us where you are." So we went over there, got our camera guys to film it, and this buck was walking a circle the size of this little conference area room that we're in, just completely oblivious to humans. You could walk up and touch him on the butt, and he just barely, just completely out of it. And so after we filmed him for a while, I asked the hunter, it's one buck state. He was leaving. That was his last day of the hunt for the season. I said, "Do you mind dispatching the deer? Because I'd like to see what's going on." And so he dispatched the deer. And I took it home and bleached it out, and lo and behold, it was what I thought it was. And I'll let Karl explain what this is and its significance in the Southeast.
Yeah, it's actually goes beyond the Southeast. There are several pockets of this throughout the country as well. And this is what is called a cranial abscess. And deer, when they're fighting, are actually injuring this part of their body tremendously, and is not really vascularized. They a lot of times get an infection. Sometimes you might be peeling an antler back, you'll see a little bit of pus in there or something like that. That little bit of infection. That little infection kind of gets walled off. It becomes purulent, and in most cases, it heals over, but not in all cases. Even though what Brian was talking about, sometimes those little pedicles where the antler pedicle breaks off, that's probably not the actual breakage of the pedicle, but it's probably related to this disease as well. It turns out there's a type of bacteria called Truparella pyogenes, which is a very ubiquitous bacteria. It's on all deer. You find it just about everywhere. It's throughout the country. It causes mastitis in sheep and stuff like that. It's a very common environmental bacteria. But that is what we've discovered is the cause of this. The Trupperella bacteria gets in there. It causes a purulence disease, and if it progresses, it can cause some very bad antler abnormalities. You'll almost always get some type of abnormal shedding of the antler, and you get a malformed pedicle after that. Many times that will heal over, and subsequently you'll end up. Is that one, Brian?
This one had a little example of it, if I remember right.
Yep.
Yes.
Sometimes you'll get very enlarged bases on these things with another points coming, all kinds of weird points coming out, and then a weird antler from that. That is a buck that has recovered from that infection, from that bacteria, and it may be completely normal for the rest of.
Yeah, that's a good example of one starting.
Yeah.
Here, hold it up for the camera.
So the base of this pedicle, you can actually see the erosion and the pitting that the bacteria causes. And this condition takes a few years, so it doesn't take them out like that, right? So if you think of the brain being a very warm petri dish, that's basically what it is, right? So bacteria has to find its way into the brain.
Well, before we get to the brain aspect where it can cause mortality, sometimes they can completely recover from this thing. They will have a malformed antler for the rest of their life, and it will always be that way. There are cases where if this bacteria the disease progresses far enough, it goes from what's called a cranial abscess to a brain abscess, where it works its way through the sutures and actually gets inside the cranium of the deer and causes an infection to the brain. And that's what happened with this deer. You can see this one. You want to show it a little closer there.
Yeah.
You can see all the pitting and erosion that occurred that weakened that substrate. Mm-hmm. And so basically it got so bad inside this deer's head that it weakened the base around his antlers. He still thought he was a buck, right? I mean, he still is a buck. So he's going to spar and fight, and he was probably just doing a natural sparring with another buck or working a rub tree and literally tore his whole pedicle and antler and exposed his brain to the world. And once the brain is exposed to the world, it's a pretty short ride to the finish line from there. And so he was hours at best away from a natural, painful death if we didn't dispatch him. But what's really interesting, and I think you were there, Carl, we went down to the famous comedian Jeff Foxworthy's property some years ago as part of a research project with UGA.
Yeah, and that's kind of embarrassing for me as well. Because we were after one particular buck who we knew had one of these. He had an antler that was just hanging off his head. And I was on a food plot trying to kill this deer. And this buck came out, and he was chasing a doe. His antler was flopping like this, with part of his skull attached, so underneath the skin.
Oh.
But he was still chasing that doe. And I saw him at about 300 yards at a trot, and I missed the sucker. I flat out missed.
There was another buck killed on that particular hunt by a mutual friend, David Osborne. And what was interesting about this deer is he came out. He was clearly the dominant buck among his group, and this area was known to have a lot of this disease, so that's why we were there specifically. It's a part of Georgia. We can talk about why in a minute. Anyhow, he was the dominant buck. He was bluffing him back. You could see the pus draining down the side of the head. Deer was harvested, took it back. Everybody's excited. Us biologists get really excited about geeky pus stuff around deer antlers. So we're all around the skin and shed, and they start to excise the tissue, remove the tissue around the pedicle, and the thing just fell off. The only thing that was holding that pedicle in place was the hide of the deer. It was basically that situation here, but just before the antler just pulled out.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, so this is something we're only learning about really in the last 15 years. And
so that deer certainly was not going to make the next year anyways.
Yeah. But some do. Some struggle for a long time.
It's interesting, though, that bacteria is very ubiquitous. But it seems like there's pockets of where this disease occurs more commonly in other places. Wisconsin, some areas in Wisconsin, some areas in Maryland, it's very, very prevalent. And in Georgia, it's distributed in a particular area, particularly in southwest Georgia, in some of those regions down there. And it's much less common. It almost doesn't even exist up in the mountains or in the lower coastal plains. So I had a graduate student, Brad Cohen, at the time. He was working on his PhD. He was actually looking into this. And we were looking at the bacteria itself. And it turns out if you look and you plot out the map of where we had incidences of this cranial abscesses occurring, and overlaid it with a distribution of the map where deer were restocked during the restocking ages, most of those areas that had a high prevalence of the disease were restocked with Wisconsin deer. So we went back and looked at the records of where those deer came from when it was Wisconsin, and most of them came from an area up there called the Sand Hills Game Farm up there, and they were brought to Georgia and stuff. And we contacted them, and we asked them about their incidence of cranial abscesses, and they said, yeah, we got it all the time up there.
We brought it with us.
We brought it with us. So then Brad got looking at it a little bit deeper and actually looked at the actual bacteria, and he looked at what are called virulence factors. And it turns out that those bacteria that came with those deer, the same bacteria, but they were a different strain of that bacteria that had much higher virulence factors that allowed them to attack the animal more vigorously than a normal, that's what would have been normal. So when we move deer around the country like that during the restocking ages, one thing you got to remember, every time you're moving a deer, you're moving a biological package. You're not only moving the deer, you're moving everything that's on that deer. Whether it's a parasite, whether it's a bacteria and stuff like that. So you're moving them into new parts of the environment that probably they weren't used to as well. And what we ended up doing in Georgia is we restocked a lot of our areas with deer that had a very virulent bacteria associated with it that's causing a lot of these cranial abscesses.
Mm-hmm. Well, I think a good wrap up to this genetics discussion, because I know we're probably running a little short on time, is to conclude with the research. All right, let's assume a best case scenario here. We can pick the genetic culls out of this pile of antler deformities. Pick only those that have bad genetics. Mm-hmm. All right. Can we cull that out of a herd, and removing them, does it matter in a wild situation? So the best research done in Texas, in fact, started on the famed King Ranch. I was part of that. Karl was part of that. They took two 10,000-acre sections of the King Ranch. It's a big place. Two small pastures, 10,000 acres each. And on one 10,000-acre area, they culled intensively, every age class. They had strict criteria. If you were a year and a half, if you were a spike or 3 points, you were gone. If you were 2.5, if you didn't have at least 6 points, you were gone. If you were 3.5 and older, 8 points, and they did it with a level of precision that no hunting club in America could do. Because they have trained guides. They even used helicopters and net guns and assessed them on the ground in some cases and either euthanized them or let them go. So, this was a level of sophistication. Can culling improve genetics in a free-ranging deer herd? So they had one 10,000-acre treatment area, culled intensively, removed 157 bucks over 7 seasons. This adjoining 10,000-acre pasture, no cull bucks removed. After the end of that 7 years, they come in with helicopter net gun crews, and in that habitat, you can catch 100 bucks a day. So, you can catch a lot of bucks, right? So they were able to catch almost every buck on both of those areas, or high enough percentage. And then they compared antlers to antlers, age for age. How does 1.5 compare, 2.5, 3.5, 4.5? And they found exactly no difference. And in fact, the antlers on the culled area were slightly smaller, not statistically significant, but they made zero difference. So the researchers said, well, that's great. That's 10,000-acre scale, 7 years. Maybe the scale and the duration wasn't big enough to see the effect. So they moved it into a confined situation. And Donnie Drager with Texas A&M Kingsville did this research for years. And they were able to control it and really look at this on a small scale and repeat it season after season after season.
In a high-fenced area.
In a high-fenced, controlled, high-fenced, smaller pen situation with different treatment, different culling regimes. And they found that by culling these bad deer, so-called bad deer, out, they eventually ran out of deer before they saw an effect. So they, even in a controlled environment. So what does all this mean? That if your justification for removing a buck on your property is to improve genetics, you're absolutely fooling yourself. Period. Okay? Even if it is genetic based. Now, does that mean that some of these deer shouldn't be removed for management purposes? No, absolutely. There are many of these deer that were shot very purposely for management reasons. They're not going to produce the antlers we want. They're going to consume feed and resources, maybe bully some other bucks off our property. So there are very legitimate reasons to shoot bucks with misshapen antlers. But don't fool yourself into believing it's all genetics, or that even if it is genetics, that it's going to make a difference in a free-ranging gene flow. Gene flow across the whitetails range is wide and deep. And research would go into many bucks breeding many does. The genetic pool is wide. You're not going to affect it. It's like literally taking 1 cup of fresh water and dumping it into the ocean and trying to change salinity. You
got to keep in mind too that a large proportion of the bucks on your property were not born there.
That's right.
They are dispersers. They disperse either as button bucks, or they disperse at a year and a half age, mostly at a year and a half year old. and they're brand new deer. They're carrying the genetics from somewhere else where you weren't calling.
Yeah.
So
it's way more complex than hunters want to appreciate. And what you definitely don't want to do on a property, and this is my last comment on this subject, but I think it's an important one. Be careful when you open up the, quote, cull buck opportunity on a property, because it will be abused, and it's an excuse for hunters to shoot bucks, in many cases, I would say most, that shouldn't be shot. So if I was with a hunting club, I would say only these 3 deer. I would not give them unlimited parameters to shoot cull bucks. I would say, hey, we've identified these 3 that we've got 2 years on now. We've seen some these. If you see one of these 3 or this one buck or whatever, you can take him. But open it up wide, you're going to see too many deer come to the skinning shed. I've seen it where a guy brought in a deer with a broken main beam. Other side normal, broken main beam. It's a cull. No, that's not a cull.
in today's world with cameras, we've got pictures of most deer on a property and stuff. I mean, you can come up with a photo album for them and say, these are the deer that are takers.
Yeah.
And it makes it easy for them at that point.
Yeah.
But you have to have somebody that making the call.
Definitely. Man, we're running up against time, but I know we could keep going for probably another 2.5 hours because this topic is kind of like you just said a minute ago. It is wide and deep. You can go as far down the rabbit hole as you want. Jacob, do you have anything before we kind of wrap it up?
No, but again, there's some stuff brought up in this podcast. I'm interested to see what comments look like. It'd be interesting.
I want to hear about Bud Light. I want to hear people's thoughts on Bud Light.
I mean, great conversation. But no, guys,
we're going to talk about gender identity, nymphomania. What all subjects did we touch on in this? Pines are better than oaks.
That's the most controversial of all.
Oh yeah, listen.
Pines being better than oaks.
Oh,
now
yeah,
the good thing about the pine situation is that typically you're left with the SMZs. So you typically, even under an intensive pine situation, you've got enough hardwoods to get you by.
Yeah.
Oh, that reminds me. I did have one last question on that. So you say that that like a mast crop doesn't necessarily affect antler size, right? Now, but when they're eating that.
With a caveat.
So I think that's where I'm going. Let me know if I'm like thinking of this right. So throughout the fall, they're eating all that mast and they're putting on that fat, so they're healthier going into the spring. So if you have a total bust year and you have a very small mat, like the oaks just didn't produce, will that affect antler quality because they don't have those fat reserves going through?
If it is a mass-driven population, so if you look at our North Georgia mountains where there's no agriculture, no food plots, it's just an oak system, yeah, absolutely, mass failure drives those herds. In most hunting club situations, the acorn crop is a minimal effect on the overall nutritional plane of a year for a deer. But you definitely want you certainly they help fatten deer. Fat deer overwinter better. They start the spring better. So yeah, there's value to acorns. Don't let your listeners and viewers think that we said that there's no value to oaks. That's not what we said.
Yeah.
We said that an unlimited oak forest is not better than a mixed forest with a lot of pine trees. Pine trees during their life cycle of a normal industrial cycle of 25 to 30 years, there are pockets during which are way better than a mature oak forest.
Yeah, the North Georgia mountains, a lot of the sand ridges, parts of Florida as well, are mass-driven economies up there for the deer, and it's been shown for years that a mass failure can have an effect even on survival, but it definitely affects antler production and reproduction in the following years. So in those situations, but in most cases where if you've got your habitat managed right, you should look at your acorns as a blessing, not as a crutch.
Okay.
100%.
Nice.
Hopefully, some of those people got maybe a little upset about that initial conversation.
Maybe they're editing their comments.
Well, maybe hopefully they made it to this point, so they kind of we didn't walk it back, but we kind of elaborated a little bit more. But no, gentlemen, I appreciate y'all joining us on this segment of the episode. I know we got another one we're going to be doing a little bit later on today. It will come out in a couple weeks for everybody watching and listening to the podcast. So. Other than that, guys, thank y'all for joining us. And listeners, thank y'all for watching the podcast. Thank you for listening to the podcast. And we'll catch you back here on the next episode from the Southern Outdoorsman podcast. Remember, guys, y'all stay Southern.